there. You know, you've developed a community. You know, you've got your resources there. Your network of help is there. And to just pick up and leave and go so far to an unknown was a challenge for a lot of people that took a lot of faith. And that route, you know, to put it in perspective, we looked at this. It's like leaving from Stoughton and going down to North Carolina. I mean, on foot, not knowing what's going to be there when you get back. And so we looked at these three waves of parties that return. And we just, you know, we talked about this last time, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it now. But again, there were three groups of people that came. And when they returned, it was initially that small portion that came back. 42,360 people, the record says. And of those, you know, included in that record were animals, beasts of burden, you know, what they call it. The returning exiles had 8,000 beasts of burden, which meant that there was really one animal to carry the belongings of 5 returning exiles. And, you know, when I think about that, it's like, okay, wait a minute, you know, we take these kids to CYC weekends, and we're trying to figure out, okay, how do we load everything into the trunk of the car, right? You know, we have to get these clamshell things that fit on the roof. I mean, and they're talking about all of their worldly belongings going 800 miles and saying, okay, we got to put 5 of our, you know, all 5 of us have to pool our resources, and we have 1 donkey to carry it all.
2 pair of sandals and a sleeping bag.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So that gives you an idea. Now, picture yourself. You've been in Babylon for 70 years. My guess is the people that are returning, the majority of the people that are returning to Jerusalem had never been there. They only heard stories. How many of you 70-year-olds want to say, you know, okay, I'm going to go and do a hoof and foot for 1,000 miles, right? I mean, you're not going to, you know, it's going to be a real challenge for a lot of the older generation. So the majority of the people that are coming back only heard stories of Jerusalem. They only heard stories about how wonderful it was. And when, in Jesus' day, the Jews would come to Jerusalem for these pilgrimage festivals, it was a magnificent thing. You know, you think of these people, you know, living in Judea or living in Galilee, and they've got to travel down to Judea. And these children, and they're walking, and they've never been to Jerusalem before. And they come down and they look up, and there on the mountain is God's holy temple. And it was just this source of great pride for the Jews. It was a magnificent thing, something that they had never seen before. The edifice of that temple was huge in those days. And for people who lived in, you know, farming and fishing villages where there was never any buildings that size, it was just mind-blowing. But it's different now. They're returning from Babylon. And as they're coming, you know, they realize, okay, we're getting close. It's coming closer. But have you thought about what that place must have looked like after laying dormant for 70 years? They were returning, brothers and sisters, to absolute, utter desolation. This is a picture of a village in France. This picture is of a village that was destroyed by the Germans during World War II. And what the Germans had done is they had gathered up the people of that city and they murdered them all. And as a testament, as a memorial to that village, they never rebuilt that city. And so you can go to that city in northern France today, and it looks just like it did when the Germans left. Now imagine what it must have been like for the Jews coming back and seeing the results of Nebuchadnezzar's destruction of Jerusalem. Turn with me to Isaiah 64. We're going to look at verses 10 and 11. Your sacred cities have become a desert. Even Zion is a desert. Jerusalem, a desolation. Our holy and glorious temple where our fathers praised you has been burned with fire, and all that we treasured lies in ruins. That's what it was like for these people to come back. They journeyed all this way, and they came to a ruin. And it was there that they had to make their lives again. They left what was a comfortable life in Babylon. Granted, they were an exiled people to Babylon, but they were allowed to live there. They were allowed to marry there. They had a community there. They gathered by the rivers there. And now they've come back to this place. And you can imagine what it must have been like for them. And so when they first arrived, Ezra tells us that they began the process of rebuilding. So turn with me now to Ezra chapter 2. Okay. Ezra chapter 2, towards the end of the chapter, we're going to look at the 68th verse. The 64th and the 64 through 67 is sort of the summary of all of those that returned. This is the one that tells us that there were the 42,360 people that came back. These are the verses that tell us the number of donkeys that came back. But then in the 68th verse it says, when they arrived at the house of Yahweh in Jerusalem, some of the heads of the families gave free will offerings toward the rebuilding of the house of God on its site. According to their ability, they gave to the treasury for this work 61,000 drachmas of gold, 5,000 minas of silver, 100 priestly garments. So the first part of the rebuilding was actually pooling their resources so that they had the funds to begin the construction. Now, when Cyrus let them leave Babylon, Cyrus was kind enough and generous enough to allow them to return with money and with the provisions that had been stolen from the temple. Do you remember that? And that's found in Ezra chapter 1. So if you look at Ezra chapter 1, verse 8, Cyrus, king of Persia, had them brought by Mithredath the treasurer, who counted them out to Sheshbazzar, the prince of Judah. And this was the inventory, 30 gold dishes, 1,000 silver plate. So, I mean, they came back not empty-handed. But even when they arrived and they saw that utter desolation, they realized, we need to give money. We have to do something to rebuild this place. It's going to take some funds. It's going to take some resources. And I think that's a great example for us, a lesson, an exhortation for us. Because, the people here in this room, we are, believe it or not, among the richest people in the world. We are richer than kings that lived 200 years ago. We live in an environment where we have the greatest and the best of anything and everything. And to an extent, we have a responsibility, brothers and sisters, to be generous with our funds. To our brothers and sisters that are in other parts of the world, to people around. And I think this is what they learned. And, I've got this picture here that I pulled off the internet of, an older woman holding what? What is she holding there? The two widow mites, right? Those are the widow's mites. And I think that that's a lesson that we learn not only from the New Testament, where Jesus, recounts that story, but also here in the book of Ezra, where they gave according to their ability. That picture didn't come out as well as I was hoping. Can anybody tell what that is?
It's a person somewhere.
Yeah. So those are all. I thought it was going to be this great idea. It kind of flopped.
It's a great slide.
It's a great slide. So for those of you that use Facebook, this is sort of this white area is supposed to be, the Facebook image, the logo of the person. And these are all individual picture profiles of people who use Facebook. And so I suppose if you stand back where maybe Scott is, or maybe across the street, you might be able to see that there's a person there. But the reason I did that is because Ezra chapter 3 tells us that the people gathered as one. And that's the point, brothers and sisters. We are the body of Christ. There are many members, but we make up the one body. And that unity is something that the Jews were experiencing now that they came back to Jerusalem from captivity. Remember, they had just gone, 70 years earlier, 100 years earlier, they had been in the midst of a civil war. With Israel in the north and Judah in the south, the 10 tribes in the north. And we talked about how the Assyrians came in and they captured these 10 tribes and they brought them out into captivity, and they were sort of, what? Lost. They're gone. And some of those that lived in the north came down to the south out of, looking for protection from the Assyrians. But when they came back from Babylon, all of the tribes, there were some from all of the tribes, and they gathered as one man in Jerusalem, it says. Chapter 3, verse 1. When the 7th month came, and the Israelites had settled in their towns, the people assembled as one man in Jerusalem. A couple of points there. The first is that it was the 7th month. I think that it took them 7 months from when they arrived to sort of settle in. They were coming to absolute, as we said, utter destruction. And they settled in. And they didn't live in Jerusalem. You see what it says? They settled in their towns. My guess is that Jerusalem had been so thoroughly destroyed by the Babylonians, by fire, that they couldn't live in the city. And as a result, they lived outside the city, in the towns, the areas that perhaps escaped much of the destruction of that Babylonian army. And so they came and they gathered in that one place. Chapter 3, verse 2. Then Jeshua, son of Josedek, and his fellow priests, and Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, and his associates, began to build the altar of God to sacrifice burnt offerings on it. And what we're going to see is that the Jews who returned prioritized the building. They started first with the altar, next they built the temple, and finally in Nehemiah's days they built the walls. Now, coming to a place, that might be the opposite of what the human approach would be. So if you were to return to a place that had been destroyed by armies, in those days, what was most important about a city was what?
Walls.
It was the walls. It was the walls that kept the enemies away. And so you'd think that, well, when we get there, we'll first build up the walls and we'll protect ourselves. And once we're protected, then we can begin the building. But that's not what they did. Instead, they said the first thing we need to do is we need to prioritize our building by building the altar so that we can sacrifice the burnt offerings to God as a way of demonstrating, as a way of showing, as a way of thanking our Heavenly Father for bringing us back to this land. And I think there's a great lesson for us there about how we should and how we do prioritize our lives. That God comes first. What was it? Scott, help me out. Who was the, way back when there was a movie, Brian Song? Do you remember that?
Yes.
And this guy,
Gail
Sayer, and he said, God first, others second.
Family second, him third.
And myself third, right? And in a way, that's sort of what we're seeing here. We're seeing God being placed first. And I think that's a great lesson that they needed to learn.
Were they
Now-
serving God in captivity?
Say it again?
Were they serving God in captivity? Were they sacrificing items?
Well, no, they weren't sacrificing, Sandy, but it was in captivity that this, sort of the concept of the, not the temple. What do the Jews, the Jews have, what do they have today? Not temples. Synagogues. Yeah, big word. So it was that synagogue process started in captivity. And you'll remember in one of our first classes on the subject, we went to Psalm 137. It was by the rivers of Babylon we wept. And the thought is that the Jews would still congregate. They drew a lot of comfort and strength from their association with other Jews. There was a cultural thing involved, and that cultural identity brought them together. So they didn't worship in a sacrificial way. They weren't permitted to do that. That was the main reason why Nebuchadnezzar brought them out of the land and exiled
This was
them.
a real big deal that they were serving God together and sacrificing.
This was huge.
Together,
This
yeah.
was huge. So for 70 years. And so that brings me up to this. So here in verse 2 of chapter 3, it says, Jeshua, son of Josedek. Do you see that?
Mm-hmm.
And his fellow. That man, Jeshua, was the grandson of the very last high priest that served in Jerusalem prior to the destruction of the city. And they had it was that they kept their genealogy. They understood who it was. Remember, the priests, they were priests because God appointed Aaron as priest. And then from that point on, it was only the descendants of Aaron that were permitted to serve in that way. And so you couldn't just say, as we're driving out of our neighborhood today, there were signs, Trowbridge for selectmen. It wasn't like they ran for office. This was something that was handed down based on their lineage. And that's exactly what happened here. So if you go to 2 Kings chapter 25, verse 18, let's just flip over there.
What chapter was that?
2 Kings 25, verse 18. It says, the commander of the guard took as prisoners Seraiah the chief priest, Zephaniah the priest next in rank, and the 3 doorkeepers. And when we come back to, if you flip back to Ezra 3, it says, Jeshua, son of Josedek, and his fellow priest, and Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel. And I think there's a connection there. I've got 3 or 4 different passages written in my margin. We're not going to take time to do it now, but trust me when I tell you that this man, Jeshua, was the grandson of the very last high priest. I think that's pretty fascinating, that they had kept those records. It was that important. And when they came back, their priorities were right. They wanted first and foremost to offer sacrifices to God. So staying in chapter 3, let's just continue to read on. Verse 3. Despite the fear of the people around them, they built the altar on its foundation and sacrificed burnt offerings on it to the Lord, both the morning and evening sacrifices. So the point is, speaking of the walls, despite the fear of the peoples around them. It wasn't like they were there and, these people that were in the surrounding area said, oh, the Jews are back. Let's bring a cake. They weren't very happy about the whole thing. And so they were fearful, but they weren't fearful enough to build the walls first. They still built the altar. And maybe they looked over their shoulders while they built it, but they built it. And then once it was built, the beginnings of chapter 3 tell us that they started to offer these burnt offerings to God, both morning and evening. And in verse 5 it says, after that they presented the regular burnt offerings, the new moon sacrifices, the sacrifices for the appointed sacred feast to the Lord, as well as those brought as free will offerings to the Lord. This was a huge thing. They were back in the land. They were worshiping their God, Yahweh, in the appointed way. And once the altar was built, then they began to rebuild the foundation of the temple. And that's described beginning in the 7th verse. Ezra 3, verse 7. Then they gave money. Again, we see the importance of money. Then they gave money to the masons and carpenters, and gave food and drink and oil to the people of Sidon and Tyre, so that they would bring cedar logs by sea from Lebanon and Joppa, as authorized by Cyrus, king of Persia. You know, they get to this place. The place is a rubble. It's just torn down. It's burned down. And there's no wood around. There's no building materials other than rock and mortar. And so they have to import these things. And they had money to do so because earlier they had given according to their ability. Cyrus had arranged for this. The king, when he allowed them to return, he sent them with funds. He sent them with the temple treasury. He arranged to allow the Sidonians to bring all of this wood. In this verse 8, in the second month of the second year, in the arrival of the house of God in Jerusalem, Zerubbabel son of Shealtiel, Jeshua son of Jozadak, and the rest of their brothers. Going on, it says that they built, verse 9, Joshua and his sons and brothers, names them all, joined together in supervising these works on the house of God. Verse 10, when the builders laid the foundation of the temple of Yahweh, the priests in their vestments and with trumpets, and the Levites, the sons of Asaph, with cymbals, took their places to praise the Lord, as prescribed by David, king of Israel. With praise and thanksgiving they sang to the Lord. He is good. His love to Israel endures forever. In other words, this 70-year captivity in Babylon was temporary. It wasn't that God had cast them off. God continued to show his love to his chosen people. And they prayed, as David did, that God's love endures forever. His love to Israel endures forever. And the people gave a great shout.
So this is just the foundation.
This is just the foundation.
Sounds so like.
The altar's been built. Now they're building the foundation. And the people shouted with a great shout when they praised the Lord, because the foundation of the house of the Lord was laid. But many of the priests and Levites and heads of fathers' houses, old men who had seen the first house, wept with a loud voice when they saw the foundation of this house being laid, though many shouted for joy. Why this discrepancy? Why this dichotomy? The old ones had seen the original temple. They remembered how beautiful it was. And this new one, all that they had now was the foundation, and it paled in comparison to what was there before. And I think there's a lesson, in Ecclesiastes, the writer says, do not say the old days were better than now. I can't remember where that is. Ecclesiastes 3 maybe. Does anybody know where that is? And I think we have a tendency to do that, don't we? We have a tendency to go back and say, oh, the old days were great. And we might, have very fond recollections of the old days. And sometimes, if you're like me, our remembrances are somewhat colored, right? It's not always as good as we remember. And when we sort of glorify the old days, it can, I would guess, be a discouragement to the younger people. And perhaps that was what was happening here. They were praising God because the foundation was laid. Think of all of these young people who are busting their hump trying to get this foundation done, while the older ones who are unable to build because of their infirmities. The thing is done, and they cross their arms and they say, not as good as it used to be. Right? I mean, how discouraging. But they were there, they were together, and many shouted aloud for joy. Now, something happens here, brothers and sisters, that I think is really fascinating. They're building, they're a small group of people. 42,000 is not tiny. And they're rebuilding the temple of God. What happens next is some people from the surrounding areas, they come with their cakes to welcome them. And they say, hey, guess what? We're here and we want to help you. And who were they? They were the Samaritans. And this was, I think, one of the greatest tests of this returning group of exiles. Because when you think about why the Jews were brought into captivity in Babylon, it was for one reason and one reason only. It was because they were unfaithful to God. How were the Jews unfaithful to God? They were unfaithful because they worshipped idols. And before the captivity in Babylon, the land of Israel was polluted with idols. This is an archaeological discovery of teraphim. And teraphim were these household gods. And archaeologists have discovered hundreds of these things throughout the land of Israel. And you can remember the story of Rachel and Leah, and they stole these household gods from their father. And those things were, that wasn't a unique situation. It wasn't a unique story. The archaeologists tell us that these gods were all over the place. But then the archaeologists also tell us that there was a point in time where those things were never discovered again. So when they discover these things, the way they date them is they look at the pottery, the potsherds that were in the area at that time. And they were able to determine, based on the style of pottery, how the pottery was constructed, the approximate age of these things. But at a certain point in time, the teraphim that archaeologists discovered no longer had any modern type of pottery. And what it leads people to believe, and what the scriptures tell us, is that after their captivity in Babylon, the Jews never again worshipped idol gods. And this was the first test of that. The Samaritans came. Now, before we get into the actual story of the Samaritans, I just want to re-emphasize the fact that the reason for the captivity was because of their unfaithfulness. And we find that in 1 Chronicles chapter 9, in the first verse. And I'll just read that quickly. It says, all Israel was listed in the genealogical record book of the kings of Israel. The people of Judah were taken captive to Babylon because of their unfaithfulness. That's what the scriptural record says. Now, Ezekiel also prophesied the same thing. And more specifically, he says it's not just unfaithfulness to God, it's the way they were unfaithful. And it's here that Ezekiel identifies the idolatry of the issue as the issue. Ezekiel 14, verse 4. God says to Ezekiel, therefore speak to them and tell them, this is what the sovereign Lord says. When any Israelite sets up idols in his heart and puts a wicked stumbling block before his face and then goes to a prophet, I, the Lord, will answer him myself in keeping with his great idolatry. And how was God, the sovereign Lord, going to answer these idolatrous Jews? Verse 21 of the chapter, Ezekiel says, for this is what the sovereign Lord says, how much worse will it be when I send against Jerusalem my 4 dreadful judgments, sword and famine and wild beasts and plague. He's saying, look, because of your unfaithfulness, because of your worship of idols, Jerusalem will be destroyed. And that's exactly what happened. And now they're back in the land. They've learned their lesson. They are to be a monotheistic group of people that worships Yahweh, the God of Israel, and Yahweh only, the sovereign Lord. And the Samaritans come and say, let us help you build. We'll partner with you. We can do it together. And the Jews said, no way. Ezra chapter 3, let me just flip back there. it 4, honey? Who can help me find it?
Chapter 4, verse 3, maybe? 2 and 3. Let us help you build a house.
That's it, Cindy. Thank you. Ezra chapter 4. When the enemies of Judah and Benjamin heard, we're in verse 1, that the exiles were building a temple for the Lord, the God of Israel, they came to Zerubbabel and to the heads of the families and said, "Let us help you build like you. We seek your God and have been sacrificing to him since the time of Esarhaddon, king of Assyria, who brought us here." But Zerubbabel, Jeshua, and the rest of the heads of the families of Israel answered, "You have no part with us in building a temple to our God. We alone will build it for the Lord, the God of Israel, as King Cyrus, the king of Persia, commanded us." Why? What was the problem with the Samaritans? The problem with the Samaritans is they were not monotheistic. They wanted to worship Yahweh, but they also wanted and did continue to worship idolatrous gods as well. And we find that in 2 Kings chapter 17. So this is the story of the Samaritans. 2 Kings chapter 17, and we'll just flip over to really verses 24 through 41 sort of describe the story of the resettlement of Samaria. But let's look at the 33rd verse, picking up in the 32nd. It says, speaking of the Samaritans, it says, "They worshiped Yahweh, but they also appointed all sorts of their own people to officiate for them as priests in the shrines at the high places. They worshiped Yahweh, but they also served their own gods in accordance with the customs of the nations." And so you've got this group of people, the Jews, who've been in Babylon for 70 years, and they realize the reason we're here in Babylon is because we weren't faithful to Yahweh. Now they're back, they're worshiping, they've built the altar, they're offering these sacrifices to God, and the Samaritans come and say, "We'll help you." We learned our lesson. We are not going to partner with idolatrous worship anymore. We are, from now on, a monotheistic people. And so what happened? The Samaritans, according to legend, according to Josephus, actually built on Mount Gerizim, 45 miles north of Jerusalem, a replica of the temple. It was an exact replica of the temple that was in Jerusalem. They built this on Mount Gerizim, and the reason they did it was later on. It didn't happen right away, but in Nehemiah's day, there was a high priest who married a Samaritan. And the Jews said to him, "You can no longer serve as a high priest in the temple of Yahweh. We have been instructed by our God to be monotheistic. We've been instructed by our God to marry only Israelites. And you've broken those commands." And because of that, Nehemiah 13, verse 28 tells us that they drove this high priest away. And Josephus says that this man went to his Samaritan father-in-law, and his Samaritan father-in-law built this competing temple 50 miles north on Mount Gerizim. And what's fascinating to me, brothers and sisters, is that even today, the Samaritans worship in that very place. And the archaeologists have discovered a foundation, and they've discovered an altar stone. And Samaritans, this is a picture from 2007, but we just had Passover. The Samaritans in that area still go to Mount Gerizim. They offer sacrifices on that very place. This is what was going on, and the Jews said, "We don't want to have any part of it." God says the temple's to be in Jerusalem. Sandy?
That's been a big conflict, for the older people coming back. They were young at the time. And so why don't we want the Samaritans to help us? Why not? They'll make it bigger and better. And,
Perhaps,
it must
yeah.
have been a big conflict.
Yeah,
within
perhaps.
That 50,000 people to try to,
Yeah.
some wanted to accept it and some didn't.
Right. But I'm convinced that they learned the lesson. And I'm convinced of that because we never again see them worshiping idols. Not physical idols. They like us, they create idols in their minds, like we do sometimes. But this, I think, for me, helps me understand what Jesus meant when he was talking to the Samaritan woman by the well. And he says, look, you need to worship in spirit and in truth. The Samaritans had the right spirit. They wanted to worship God. They wanted to help. They wanted to do all these good things. But it's not just that. You have to do it the right way. You have to worship in spirit and in truth. And that's the lesson that they didn't get. We're almost done. We've got 2 more slides. What we see now is that the nations around them start to oppose the building of the walls, the building of the temple. They see this as a threat. And this threat wasn't just a short-lived thing. We see here that it began in the days of Cyrus, king of Persia, and it lasted all the way to the days of Darius, king of Persia. And in the reign of Ahasuerus, or the NIV calls him Xerxes, in the beginning of his reign, they wrote an accusation against the inhabitants of Judah. And then later, after Ahasuerus came on and left the scene, Artaxerxes came. And in the days of Artaxerxes, Bishlam and the Mithridath and Tabeel and the rest of their associates wrote to Artaxerxes, king of Persia. And the letter was written in Aramaic and translated. And they were opposing the building. So there was all sorts of animosity among the people around them. They could have built the wall first. They didn't. Their priority was to worship God. And the people were opposed to them. And the reason they were opposed was because they were motivated by the love of money. Ezra chapter 4, verse 6. We're running out of time. I just want to get to this because I'm going to be away next week. Ezra 4, verse 6. At the beginning of the reign of Xerxes, or Ahasuerus, they lodged an accusation against the people of Judah and Jerusalem. Now remember how we said at the first slide that this is a period that incorporates not only the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, but it incorporates the book of Esther? This accusation in Ezra chapter 4, verse 6, is the very accusation that we read about in the book of Esther, where Mordecai comes to the king and he says, there is a certain group of people that are opposed, that won't bow down to me, Mordecai says. And so he goes to King Ahasuerus and he says, I want you to destroy them. Esther chapter 2, verses 8 through 10. Let's just turn over a couple of pages. And the reason why the king is persuaded is because of the love of money. Esther 2, verses 8 through 10. Haman, I was talking about Mordecai. Haman said to King Ahasuerus, there's a certain people dispersed and scattered among the peoples in the provinces of your kingdom, whose customs are different from those of the other people, and who do not obey the king's laws. It's not in the king's best interest to tolerate them. If it pleases the king, let a decree be issued to destroy them. And I will put 10,000 talents of silver in the royal treasury for the men who carry out this business. So my question is, where is Haman going to get these 10,000 talents of silver? They're coming from the spoils of those who have been murdered. Those Jews that would be murdered by Haman's horrible plan would have their houses, their goods sold, and that money would go into the treasury. And so it's the love of money which is the root of all evil, and it's causing these kings to do evil things against the Jews. Ezra chapter 4, verses 7 through 13 tell us the same thing. They commanded the rebuilding to stop because Mithridath, who was the treasurer in Persia, said if they build this thing, they're going to stop paying tribute taxes. And so the king saw this, and he issued an edict to stop the building. And it stopped. They immediately went to the Jews in Jerusalem, compelled them by force to stop. And it did.